Good evening. We are going to close our section. Everyone looked a little bit tired, but I hope you all will try for the last moment. We are having the last section of the 10th International Conference on South China Sea. It's also the last section of the 10 conferences that we have organized in the last 10 years. It is very important. We look back in the last 10 years, we are happy to say that we have done a fairly and constructive good jobs. We have get together, speaking out all in our mind in a frank way concerning the environment of South China Sea. And we also have speak out what we want other people to do to secure order and stability and peace in the region. However, up to this moment, we all realize that the rule-based order in South China Sea is under serious challenges. That's why our section this time, though everyone is tired, but we are tasked to find out what we are going to do in the next 10 years. Because our meeting, our conference is not end at the 10th time, but it is to be continued until, I hope, we can solve the problem, remaining peace, stability, and environment in the region. It's important section, but our time is limited. We have only 1 hour, 10 minutes. And we have 5 speakers, very well-known speakers. So I hope that each of speaker can have 7 minutes to present what you want to present to the seminar. And the rest of the time, we spare for the question and answer. To start with, may I introduce Professor Thayer from the University of New South Wales, Australia.
Thank you, Ambassador Phung. Once again, the shoe's on the other foot. I had 12 minutes last time, now 7 at short notice. Don't start the time until I start talking. I did have a PowerPoint presentation here. I don't know where to point to. Okay. Well, how did you get it to go? That's what okay, yeah. I work in a military environment in my entire professional career, so those of you who have had military service will know what I mean by commander's intent. So I read the guidelines today, and I took that as the commander's intent, and it was my obligation to reply to it. So I'm looking back at the order in the South China Sea, disorder in the South China Sea, looking back for transformations, looking forward, and the Leninist, what is to be done. If we go back, what a thing for 50 years of founding ASEAN and the creation of ASEAN-centric multilateral institutions. From an organization that was founded in 18 months, it couldn't do anything because of a dispute over Sabah, to now having biannual, twice a year ministerial meetings and twice and summits twice a year, where the summits were few and far between up until 1976. And we have the ASEAN way now with the debate over a qualified majority, with consensus can't be made at lower levels, but not at summit, to showing the ASEAN Charter, which gave it a legal identity, an ASEAN community of three pillars: political, security, economic, and social cultural. The ASEAN Regional Forum and the evolution finally into the stage of preventative diplomacy beyond confidence-building measures itself. The creation of the East Asia Summit and finally getting the United States and Russia to join after the initial participants had happened. And then the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting and the ASEAN Maritime Forum that were then enlarged to include the dialogue partners. So there's been a substantial evolution of these architectures. We can debate their efficacy over time. But if we're looking at disorder in the South China Sea, and around 2007, we saw the imposition of unilateral fishing bans and their enforcements, and inhumane treatment of fishermen at sea. 2009, a pivotal year with China's 9-dash line being tabled that became the cause of all evil. All the clashes and cable cuttings, Haiyang Shio 981, ramming, and the use of water cannons became an art form. Naval officers in China trained in Coast Guard to train to ram boats at sea. We had the intimidation of Vietnam in 2017 and continuing on Repsol, the exploration off Vanguard Reef. That all began in 1992, which is the first dot point in my presentation earlier. We had the militarization of the South China Sea in a very frightening, very threatening way, and that we had the arbitral award left in legal limbo. The constitution of the world's oceans rent because no one will enforce it, and ASEAN members dare not speak its name. It's a legal and diplomatic process. Only 2 or 3 countries actually used arbitral tribunal on the day it was issued, and since then they've gone quiet. So we've had disorder in the South China Sea and disorder in ASEAN itself. If we look back, tremendous transformation in the global and regional system of power. From unipolarity, the United States supreme at the end of the Cold War, its hubs and spokes system of its allies and strategic partners, to multipolarity, the rise of China, Japan reinventing itself from Article 9 and reinterpreting its constitution, in India not just looking east, but finally acting east and helping the Vietnamese Navy in Nha Trang, just up the coast, to mention that. We have middle powers, South Korea, Australia, Indonesia, playing stronger roles. South Korea providing capability in coast guards and arms sales to some of the country. And we have a shifting military balance. We had, I think, Derek Grossman quoting the Admiral that China can dominate the South China Sea short of war. That was my addition to it. And part of that transformation is China's economic rise, its expanding military reach, and you've heard all the presentations on anti-access area denial, first, second, and third island chains there. But what hasn't been stressed, and Bonjihara did it, it's very important. On Sanya, China has developed this base for submarines, and that base houses nuclear submarines. And actually, we've been talking all kinds of issues. None can be more existentially important than the deployment of nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles on submarines, and that balance or lack of balance and what happens in a crisis. And we looked at motivations and drivers. If you're China, you need a deterrent at sea to survive an American first strike to hit back. And if you go further north, there's a sound underwater system that would detect your submarines. You need access points out. And I just throw that on the table. That's hard realism, and we've all been talking around the edges. But if we're looking at strategic drivers, I would be very strong. Attack nuclear submarines and ballistic missile submarines, and the South Fleet is the repository of where that's happening in China today. That shows us their strategic priorities. We have China's political engagement. By the time America holds a summit, China had been holding summits with ASEAN for years. Free trade agreements, something that is impossible under the current Trump administration with the region, and China's trying to add value and improve it. So they have very solid and a strategic partnership with ASEAN long before the United States. and a sense of dominance over Southeast Asia because they can destroy ASEAN consensus by using some countries, and they can use their overwhelming bluster and sheer presence to make sure that people dare not speak what China doesn't want to hear. And that's even affecting a strong country like Australia, where we have been at the receiving end of united front and splittist tactics, of which Mike Pence spoke about in the United States. The United States, I only did the Obama administration because we saw tremendous rebalancing. First act, appoint an ambassador to ASEAN. Engage with ASEAN, said, show up, in Hillary Clinton's words. Accredit an ambassador. Start attending and creating ASEAN-US leaders meeting. Under Bush, he wouldn't go, and then he invited everybody to the ranch at Crawford, but said not Miramar, bad country, and ASEAN wouldn't go. ASEAN, it's one of their members. You take us all, you take none. But Obama leaders meeting, Sunnylands. ASEAN defense ministers meeting plus, working with the Lower Mekong Initiative, the Trans-Pacific Partnership until Trump got into office and killed it. And the East Asia Summit got the United States to join. So there were things. Looking forward, where are we going? And I came out to Australia in 1971 because my graduate director at Yale thought I could get a better education at the Australian National University under Professor Hedley Bull. And he went to Oxford, and he wrote a tremendous book on the anarchical society. And I don't want to be too theoretical, but the frame, I think, is very important as to where the theme is going. We have a world society of states that share certain institutions, and like any society, there are differences in values. Okay, the geopolitical system, the UN system has failed to command the monopoly of force in the world and exercise that for order and stability. The UN Security Council only did it really with Korea.
Professor, you over time.
So his world order is composed of the following elements: a balance of power, equilibrium, a special role for the great powers because of their capabilities, international law that provides the insulation, diplomacy, and war. In the sense of the Korean, is the 1950s is an example of using war to restore an order. If international law is undermined, we have more friction, and that's what I'm positing for our future. If international order is taken down, then the great powers and the elements of coercion that are part of war take their scene. So Lenin, what is to be done? This is the vision of ASEAN in 2016, so that's where they would like to go. Surrounding area, peaceful, basic norms, etc. But what I say is we have China's rejection of the compulsory dispute settlement mechanism, undermined international law, not regionally but also globally. We're now having the return of realpolitik, balance of power. Major powers will play a major role in regional affairs, and that strategic rivalry is a threat to ASEAN's centrality and regional autonomy. Now I know I'm over, but I was asked to address one final question about the usefulness of this conference with a 10-year period, because I attended with Stein back in 2009, and I've been to all but one. And if you watch the national TV, the Panorama show, I've answered that question. I said, have you ever taken a rock and thrown it into a pool? It makes ripples. Each one of us foreign delegates, when we go home, throws a rock in our country to the strategic community of analysts and specialists. And we spread out the message of what we've learned here. So that's one effect of this conference. The other has been to bring some of the contesting parties, like the Chinese, and have them hear the views of the Vietnamese and others, and we learn from the Chinese itself, and then to share the experiences of others. So it's hard to measure it if you're back in the foreign ministry saying, are we getting our value for money? But for the larger community, the ripple effect of these conferences, the education of us in international law, has been a major contribution. Thanks for your indulgence.
Thank you. You told me you were tired, but you're still strong, talking over time. Now, Dr. Zhang Feng.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me at this final session. I'm really pleased that Professor Thayer has given us a theoretical take on order in the South China Sea, and from an authority no less than Hedley Ball, who is a former head of department, my department of international relations at the Australian National University. And I'm even more pleased because I propose to give a set of conceptual remarks on building order in the South China Sea. And I want especially to highlight the importance of principles of justice in constructing order in the South China Sea. So let me explain. First of all, I can't resist the temptation as an academic to give a definition to order, regional order or international order. Order is legible, predictable behavior in accord with recognized norms. And order doesn't just mean stability, but also some kind of organizational arrangement and patterns of behavior that reflect certain norms, values, and goals. And order is not about power configuration. It's not about not just about the rise of Chinese power or the intervention of U.S. power in the South China Sea. Order is more about rules, norms, and goals. And I see 5 levels of order in any region, or order at the international level. The first level of order is moral purpose. Any order must reflect some shared values and goals among actors within that order in order to be durable. And the second level of order is organizing principle. What are the principles by which political authority is differentiated and organized? And the third level is what I want to emphasize, principle of justice. This is, I think, an extremely important source of order and of the norms and institutions of that order. A robust order must be able to meet the demands for justice from a significant number of actors within that order. I'll come to that point just in a minute. And the fourth level of order is constitutive norms and institutions. Professor Thayer has just mentioned there are several institutions of modern international order: diplomacy, international law, balance of power, great power management, and war. Finally, the fifth level of order is regimes, functional regimes that facilitate functional cooperation among actors. And these are surface-level mechanisms to address specific issues or facilitated cooperation in particular areas. In the South China Sea, the DOC and the COC readily spring to mind. Now I want to focus on what I call principles of justice. I think principles of justice are the deepest source of order. This is a question about, is an order seen as just or unjust by the relevant actors? The fundamental reason for China's changing approach to the South China Sea since around 2009, I think, amid all the various reasons given by scholars and analysts, is that the Chinese perceived that the regional order in this region had not been just for China. In particular, they felt that the configuration of positions and distribution of benefits have not been fair to China. So it wants to change that order in order to make it more just for China. But in doing so, it has inevitably raised the dilemma that attempts to make regional order more just for China may make it less just for other countries. And that is the crux of the current predicament. And so here I can make a further conceptual point. In constructing order, there's always a dilemma of justice, or a dilemma of the supply of justice. That is to say, it's impossible to satisfy the demands of all actors at the same time or to the same degree, especially over sensitive issues such as sovereignty. That said, no order, even the durable and robust ones, has fully established principles of justice that satisfy the demands of all the major actors. So the question of principles of justice is a question of degree. And so I think, and this is my conclusion, a neglected question in the study of constructing order in the South China Sea is to examine principles of justice and how all the relevant countries can strive to make the order more just for all the countries concerned. And this is a particularly important task between China and other claimant countries such as Vietnam and Philippines, and between China and the United States. And finally, to paraphrase Jeremy Bentham, the challenge is to create the greatest justice for the greatest number. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. Now I invite Jay.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I was asked to try to summarize as well and give insights on developments in these past 10 years of the South China Sea disputes. And I think this 10th conference particularly has been very good in providing us with an opportunity to really capture those developments and summarize them. If we take a look back at the past couple of days, we see several very important trends taking place in South China Sea disputes. These trends tend to be either complementary or contradictory, and it adds to the evolution, the development of the disputes. No? In no particular order, we could identify one, of course, legalization, shall we say, in which, especially in the past couple of years, more and more attention has been given to consciously frame the disputes in legal terms and to try to resolve them as well through the legal means available in international law. This trend is particularly prominent among the smaller claimant states. And this is good because it does allow or promote rather a multilateral approach which is expected to come up with a result, an outcome that is more or less acceptable to all. It is hoped that this kind of approach would lead to an outcome that tries to accommodate the most interests between them. This trend has been particularly rapid in the past few years, especially after 2009. A second trend that we see is with respect to cooperation, a shift really from rhetoric to reality, shall we say. Although this trend has been much slower in moving. Now, particularly, we see much more attention being paid by the different countries to try to come up with concrete ways to manifest this cooperation. And again, this would contribute, this is good in the sense that it would contribute to a multilateral approach to the various problems. Granted, it will not resolve all of the problems at the same time, but at least it provides a way to incrementally improve the situation of the disputes. Another related to that as well, to these two, is internationalization of the disputes, although of course some parties would not see this with favor. But the fact is that because of the recent developments, these disputes are no longer the sole concern of only the littoral states. And we see an increase and a very visible increase in attention from external states that believe themselves to be affected as well by these disputes, even though they might directly involve only a few countries. Their connection to the outside of the outside of the region is now being highlighted. Now, while these may be positive trends, there are also some negative trends. One is unilateralism. We've seen states take actions that are quite frankly irreversible and tend to try to resolve the disputes, quote unquote, in their favor prematurely, not through a process of mutual settlement and accommodation, but rather simply by appropriation of the outcome. We see this in the island building particularly, and I think that's why most of the smaller Southeast Asian states particularly have become much more concerned about these developments. Another trend is what we've described rather loosely as militarization. As Carl pointed out earlier, this is more of a spectrum, but what we see probably is more of an acceleration in the usage of military tactics or assets, no, in these disputes. And the expansion of the presence of military forces, even paramilitary forces, as well as law enforcement forces, becoming more widely distributed in the area of the dispute. And lastly, you also have the side effect of all of this activity, which is degradation of the environment in which everyone, of course, has a mutual stake. The environment and resources are suffering because of all of these activities, whether they are the direct result of some activities such as mobilization of fishermen in order to assert rights, or as side effects of some of the actions that have been taken. As I mentioned, these trends that tend to be interactive, and they either complement or contradict each other, which presents a significant challenge for all the states. In the last few years, it's like a car that suddenly accelerated unexpectedly, these trends. And now we are in a period where we've decided to try to slow things down a bit. And I think in this conference, it's like we're trying to get our bearings to try to decide what to do. One challenge is the disruption that can be caused by certain other developments, which were also noted in the conference, technology being particularly prominent in this. And we don't know yet what kind of new, what kind of impact this will have on these various trends. But one thing is sure, the management of the disputes really requires a kind of dynamic balancing between these different contending trends, and each country will try to address them in its own way. But what is necessary for a more effective management, really, it requires all of the countries to cooperate in this kind of dynamic balancing. At stake really is the so-called rules-based order. We have an existing rules-based order, and the big question now is that is the region going to experience a transition into a different kind of rules-based order, one that may not be as favorable to them, or one that they may not necessarily agree with, or are we striving towards a stabilization of what we have? This is a kind of opportunity in a way where a reordering would take place, and the region, particularly the smaller countries, have to make a decision whether this kind of, whether the rules-based order that they have is something that they would rather see maintained. No? And this is really, I guess, the biggest underlying concern for everyone. We're looking at the possibility of a kind of polarization, meaning the region being reordered and everything being reordered to orbit or around just a single pole of power, shall we say, or what I assume is the preference, which is a diversification of that power, so that we can have a kind of regional community where there is no such extended hierarchy, shall we say, and all nations in the region are basically, will basically coexist as mutual and as equals, rather. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I invite Professor Robert Beckman from the University of Singapore.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to try to add some thoughts to the process. If we think back to before the last 10 years, it was just after the Beijing Olympics. And I often ask my Chinese friends to think about what the image of China in ASEAN was at the time of the Beijing Olympics and compare it today. And I think there's much more distrust, and much more fear of China than there was at that time. Now, if we go back again to May 2009, during that period, we didn't know where economic zone claim of Vietnam was. We didn't know where the 200-mile economic zone claim of Malaysia or the Philippines was. But there was a deadline in May 2009 to submit information for outer continental shelf claims. And the result of that, the Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam amended its law, Philippines amended and finally brought their archipelagic baselines into conformity with the law of the sea. Malaysia finally issued a map as to where their 200-mile economic zone was. And the implication was the coastal states were claiming 200-mile economic zones from their coast, and they were not claiming it from any offshore islands, which meant that almost all of the fishing and oil gas resources in the South China Sea would be under the sovereign rights of the coastal state, leaving China, who was too far north, very little access to resources. And this was the start of what has now become the tensions of the last 10 years. China, in response to the one day after Vietnam and Malaysia issued their claim for an outer continental shelf, China submitted for the first time the 9-dash line map to the Secretary General and asked that it be circulated. And then there was speculation for months as to what do they mean by rights sea attached map, right? And so this began the tensions as to what China was claiming, leading up eventually to a series of incidents with Philippines and Vietnam, resulting eventually in May 2014 case brought by Philippines against China. China, during this process, continued a policy of deliberate ambiguity. I think it was a strategic error. My own view is it should have said what the 9-dash line map means historically is we claim sovereignty over the islands inside the 9-dash line, nothing else. By claiming historic rights, they triggered a series of disputes which are ongoing. Now let's look at the past 3 years. I think my view is 3 major changes have taken place. One, there's more legal certainty than there ever was, particularly as to rights to resources in the South China Sea. Like it or not, the Southeast Asian countries are going to order their conduct according to the arbitral award. Whatever China thinks about it, it's going to be the 5,000-pound gorilla in the corner of the room anytime ASEAN and Chinese countries enter into discussions. Legal certainty is not there yet with respect to the paracels. We must keep that in mind. The second change in the last 3 years, arguably, is the balance of power in the South China Sea has significantly been altered because of China's island building and militarization. And we're seeing part of the consequences of that. I won't get into all the maritime security issues. The third major change that I see is that the dispute in the South China Sea is no longer a matter between ASEAN and China. It's been internationalized. Like it or not, this is not a matter that the Chinese and the ASEAN can address, because you're now dealing not only with the United States, but France and England and India and Australia, and as of today's paper, Canada. Everybody is going to be asserting their rights because they believe the rule of law established under UNCLOS is under threat. And that rule of law took 9 years to negotiate. It creates predictability and stability in international relations, but now it's being called into question in the South China Sea, so people and states are reacting to bring law and order back. And China's on an uphill battle if it thinks it's going to have to be able to pick and choose which rules of UNCLOS it wants to follow. Got 1 minute left. I guess the question is the other issue is ASEAN. Where does ASEAN fit into this? Remember, the COC negotiations started so long ago. To a large extent, it's been overtaken by the external events that I'm talking about. On the other hand, my own view as a lawyer is that whether it's legally binding or not is really not that important. And what's more important, that it establishes some kind of framework for confidence-building measures and some kind of framework to deal with the incidents at sea that could get out of hand. If it accomplishes that and it's legal, and whether or not it's legally binding, it's far more important. I think another thing that ASEAN can do, and ASEAN centrality is critically important as one of the issues, is ASEAN can perhaps attempt to be the broker between China and the Western powers as to getting a common understanding of how the law of the sea applies in the South China Sea, and a common understanding to deal with incidents at sea. I guess the final point I'd make is, what can ASEAN do? The whole dispute is not about outside powers or China and ASEAN. There's a lot that ASEAN could do among themselves. I mentioned earlier the fact that you should be ratifying the 95 Fish Stocks Agreement and trying to create a regional fishing management organization. ASEAN countries could also be cooperating in many ways to protect the marine environment, especially from marine plastic debris. And there are many outstanding boundary issues. I would give high priority to the economic zone boundary between Indonesia and Vietnam, but also between Philippines and Malaysia. I know that's highly sensitive because of the Sabah claim, but clean up your own acts first and try to get some certainty as to where your own economic zone boundaries are. There's also a boundary between Malaysia and Indonesia that should be clarified in the southern part of the South China Sea. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Now, Dr. Do Thanh Hai, Assistant Director General of DAV.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it's always a special privilege for me to be part of the distinguished panelists to reflect on what happened over the last 10 years and over also the whole conference series. Before going to the main points, I would like to stress that my remarks are my own opinions, which would not necessarily reflect those of my institutions and also my government. And my very first observations that after 10 years is a sufficient time for us to understand what it means. Because for a long time, it's also questioned the intent of the country and what happened, what the motive, what the driver. And just we see that, the tension rise without abating for quite a while. And also the way and also the route of assertiveness and also the clash, the number of incidents increased over 10 years. And so approximately about more than 100 incidents for over the last 10 years. So it's definitely an upsurge from the different period. But for 10 years, it's a consistent effort on the part of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. And we try to promote the open, frank, and evidence-based manner. So that you see that what happened in the room and also over the last 10 years. I think the effort to bring in different perspectives and try to bring in some proposals and to maintain peace and stability, because we believe that that's in the interest of the open and frank debate and to that. And based on the idea and also principle, the first conference started. Now let's go into the thing that we will see today. I want to make two observations. I think that the first one is that the South China Sea clearly is an issue, is an international concern. And also there's been sustained international interest into what happened into the region. As Dr. Tung mentioned from yesterday, so we see, that kind of series produced enormous scholarship, about more than 350 papers and presentations and 1,000 rounds of comments, exchange of views. And And also 12 books have been published, and I think that is more beyond that, the spiritual effect of that series. Got a good number of participants participating in the conference every year, and also 100 other conference and workshop at different level, at different place. So that we see that it's a real concern over the region. It's not only the region itself, not only a matter of Vietnam, China, Philippines, Vietnam, or ASEAN, China, but it's a problem that we're facing, and the world has to deal with that. And also that we have a lot of efforts on that, but the South China Sea become more insecure, more emptier, and also more polluted. And at the moment, we still have seen the deadlock, so no ways out. And in snapshot, the South China become more a common concern. And of course, because I think it more reflects on the change in the systemic level, and also the national policies, as well as the increased nationalism in every locality we have. But I think that the particular concern is the return of geopolitics, and also the re-emergence of international security issues that is really changed the seascape in the region. And of course, although we have more than 30, exactly more than 34 mechanisms in play for the maritime security, but we still see the South China Sea and the sea beyond, it become more insecure. So from that, I want to bring back the 3 analyses together with the proposals. My first analysis, my observations is that, I'm thinking a lot about the cause of the problem and the cause of the increasing insecurity in the region. But I think that is maybe the problem of our mind rather than the complex reality. There exists the very incorrect assumption that the disputes are really impossible, really difficult to resolve. So the idea is that we should leave it for the next generation, for our kids to resolve it. But I really believe that that kind of thinking prevents us from sitting together to discuss the problems at hand, to talk about negotiation on the dispute settlement, and of course also to put some issue very complex and sensitive on the agenda. So it will be not very helpful for us, and it's urgent that the country concerned and also the international community to foster the direct negotiation among the country about the maritime limitation, about the disputation to settle the sovereignty disputes in the region. Because we cannot live for our children, for our grandchildren and grandchildren. We can leave, the hot spot into the hands, and of course, we deny our responsibility to maintain peace and stability in the region. And from that on, also, that we see that the COC is more about the peculiar than the cure to the disease we are facing. So what I call on that is we should be more focused on the settlement of disputes, or rather than it's just about the dispute management through different means. And the second one, I think that is I think about the inefficiencies of the efforts and mechanism we're facing. So I would believe that the part of the problem facing on, the rigid idea of the sovereignty. Of course, most of Southeast Asian countries and maybe China's and other regions escape from the colonialism for a short time, so the idea of sovereignty is strong. But the problem we're facing in the South China Sea and on the maritime domain is more than the national issues. It's the regional, it's transnational, and also it's very complex. It involves multi-stakeholder, especially the questions of environmental degradation, the depleting of fish stocks, and so other part of that, the freedom of navigation, and so that involve in more than the state actors. But mostly that we try to resolve and to address the issue at hand through the national policy, and the state usually believe that the sole provider of the security. That perfectly wrong. We should more focus on get more of the people on board, the business community, the fishing associations, and so the different thing, and the state users as well, because the South China Sea is not the sole security, the purview, the reality of the states. And the third point is that rule-based order is very important. But usually we have the quite passive way to deal with that. Whenever things happen, we see the massive, ways of criticism and and reaction, the cycle of action and reactions will never end. So we think about the futures and how the problem should be handled. And of course, the status quo should be maintained, and of course, but we should think into the collective policy planning or coordinations to deal with the contingency. If we see anything happen, so what we will do, deal with it together. If you just wait till the thing happen and also now, or what the country will take the action first, it's usually very hard to gain the collective actions on that. So it's better to work with each other, we think together, we plan together. So if any violations of national law and the rule-based order happen, what should the country do together and to work together on to that? So we should not, it's just reaction to reality, but we have to think ahead and we have to think very carefully about what could be happen and what is our plan and our contingencies together with that. So only by thinking forward, and so we can tackle what happened over the last 10 years. Without that, we'll see the history will make itself again, because we'll see that already happened in the South China Sea for years. It's not that South China Sea is a new thing, but already happened in the past. And so we have to change our thinking on that. With that note, I would end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have about 30 minutes. 30 minutes, yeah. Now, I'm expecting to get more and more questions from colleagues. Yes. You?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the sentiments and positive thoughts of Dr. Phung in terms of sort of what we need for a just society. I can appreciate the damage and the impact of the Opium War, the Century of Shame, etc. But I believe that there was nothing unfair or unjust in terms of the process concerning the negotiation of UNCLOS. In fact, China publicly celebrated it as a victory for the developing world. Think of Indonesia's role in the archipelagic regime, for example. And the reality is that the post-World War II order, once Beijing adjusted domestically, was extremely favorable to China's development and rise to power. So I guess my first question is, and I understand you're analysing Beijing as opposed to sort of representing, but from Beijing's perspective, what aspect of the UNCLOS negotiations were unfair? And two, how is the 9-dash line, which really claims resources pretty much close up to the beaches of the claimant countries, just or fair? Thank you.
Thank you. You?
Thank you. My question is sort of based on the same observation, a very interesting crosstalk. Obviously, when you only have 7 minutes, it's challenging to talk about other people's presentations, but I'd be interested in Bob Beckman's thoughts on sort of the same issue, but slightly differently, taking a step back. The idea that the regional order was unjust, and then raising the question of the idea of subjective senses of justice or injustice versus the rule of law and the creation of international law, and whether there's a tension between those two, where you have global regimes where the international community has gotten together and decided what the rules are, and then in particular circumstances, if countries believe that their application in particular instance seem unjust to them. Tension you were talking about that has perhaps internationalized the South China Sea a bit. So that was my question, sort of on the same topic.
Thank you. May I? This one? Yeah. You get two more questions.
Thank you. Just a quick question to the whole panel. Dr. Hai mentioned the issue of nationalism on all sides. And I would be interested to hear from any members of the panel any suggestions they may have for the countries concerned in managing this issue. Particularly because on the one hand, as Dr. Hai sort of alluded to, it offers or sort of generates a kind of threat to potentially regional stability, particularly in crisis situations, and yet on the other hand, the very fact that it poses that kind of threat means that it can be potentially used in sort of diplomatic leverage. So, I mean, back in 2011, we know the countries, between China and Vietnam at least, there was a statement that specifically alluded to the management of public opinion on this issue. We haven't seen any, as far as I'm aware, references to public opinion since then. But I wonder what the panel might suggest in terms of how to kind of incentivize countries to dampen down these sentiments, or whether indeed there are other kinds of ways of managing this issue. Thanks.
Thank you. The ones there, yes.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to ask the panelists the fundamental question. The problem is always how to avoid the military confrontation, how to establish the security network. The fundamental one is how to make China to understand China cannot challenge the international order by forces or try to change the status quo by forces. And China entered the South China Sea around middle of the 1970s. So China is, we can say that China is newcomer in the South China Sea. So the newcomer sometimes to be the disturbing factors. And I asked Chinese military officers once, and why China started using the military forces to seize the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands. They said because they did not have the capability to do that before the period. So it also means the capability may change the intention sometimes. So we need to keep discussing how. So would you give us the idea how to make China to understand the nobody can challenge the international order by forces? Thank you.
Thank you. We need one more question. Ambassador.
First, thank you for all the panelists. I want to make a comment with Dr. Feng. I was very inspired by his 5 points, that the principle of order, and one of which is justice. But I would, from a realist perspective in relation to the South China Sea, what I see is muscle power. It's nothing to do with what you say. Sorry, it's just a quick comment. I see these contestations between state is behaving its own way, irrespective of whatever you just said, the 5 points you make. So just a quick comment to you. I want to ask a question with Dr. Beckman. Although I follow closely, but there's one thing puzzled me the most, and it's very, I'm a bit surprised when you say that legal binding in a COC should not be taken too importantly. I'm not saying that you don't subscribe to the idea that COC should be legally binding. Rather, you focus on confidence building measure. Can you describe what happened when DOC was formed, particularly Article 10, which called for the creation of the COC? Can you make a statement as to why at that time leader think that there's a need for COC? What if that statement was not there? What if they somehow they didn't put that there? And looking back at what you say transpired in the last three years, particularly the Chinese, the fear of China, assertiveness, and all these things, I was just wondering. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we start the answering. The first question comes to our Feng Zhang.
Thank you for these excellent questions. I'm going to address the questions related to principles of justice, as well as to an additional question on how to contain nationalism as regard China. Chris asked a question of which aspects of UNCLOS negotiation China considers unfair. In fact, when I mention the principles of justice, I have in mind not at all UNCLOS. The discussion on UNCLOS, as far as I know, has nothing to do with unfairness or unfairness. In fact, although these days there is some discussion on the decision to join UNCLOS, on the whole, people in China think it was the right decision. When I say that China has felt part of the order was unjust, I was having particularly in mind the fact that for roughly 10 years after the signing of the DOC, according to decision makers and advisors close to decision makers, that China has largely stuck to the spirit of the DOC by exercising self-restraint. But the other claimant states, especially the Philippines and Vietnam, had not followed the letter or even the spirit of the DOC. So they felt exploited by these countries. And this was a very important source of the thinking of injustice or unfairness during those years. And it was this change of thinking that led to change of policy. And in this connection, I would like to respond to Mr. Ambassador's point about China using muscle power rather than justice. The point. Yeah, sure. Yeah. That is fine. I'm trying to make an analytical point. The point I want to make is that it is changing ideas that led to change of policy. What is the role of power, the rise of Chinese power? Power is an enabling condition and an instrumentality. Chinese power had risen, so decision makers thought that they now had the capabilities to do certain things. And in conjunction with changing ideas, this has led to change in policy. So my claim is that ideas about justice or injustice in the South China Sea is a fundamental source of Chinese policy, not power per se.
Thank you. The second question, Professor Beckman.
Yeah, a question by Bob Harris on regional order, application of UNCLOS seeming unjust to some people. I think the argument I would make is that you had a 9-year negotiation leading to a bargain which all states were able to agree with as a package deal, including China. And the People's Republic of China was represented at those 9 years of negotiation. And therefore, we shouldn't forget that. China agreed to it. China, in fact, argued against historic rights in other people's economic zones in one of the few statements it made during the negotiations. So to try to reinterpret provisions now to say certain are unfair or fair, I think we can't pick and choose. The idea of a package deal for UNCLOS, that there would be some provisions that you'd be very much in favor of and others you'd be a bit uncomfortable with, but you have to take the whole package. And I think that's what China has failed to do. It seems to want to pick and choose which provisions that it wants to comply with. It wants to reinterpret historic rights in light of now its need for resources or its large fishing fleet, which I think is a big mistake. I think if China were to simply abide by UNCLOS, it would find that as a naval power and a major trading country, UNCLOS in the long run, favors its interests far more than it disadvantages China.
Thank you, Professor. Now we are come to the questions to all speakers. Now we have two questions. The first one is the nationalism. And nobody wants to talk about nationalism and to minimize its effects to the solution. The second question is avoid the confrontation. And to China, at present time, we try to access to force, military force. And the question is why China comes late to the region, to South China Sea. But it is the first one who access to armed forces. These two questions to all five speakers. Carl, you want to speak?
I'm not going to be very good on the nationalism because I'm going to speak the words nobody will. Great Han chauvinism, national patriotic campaigns at home that whipped up the Chinese people to believe that some pre-existing colonial order where China was the center of heaven and other countries were just supplicants should be replaced, and that the outside powers have no role in the region. So that's the great China dream. The century of humiliation is to stoke great Han chauvinism. And if you go on the net, and I repeat what I often said, this is a legacy that neither Ho Chi Minh nor Mao wanted to confer to both their citizens. And on the Vietnamese side, if you read the net war, the netizen war between young Chinese and Vietnamese, it's scatological. And the leaders once agreed to control public opinion. And that's the case, that we need a different kind of education program in both countries to tone down that rhetoric. And there are exchanges between the two countries with young people going on and young military officers to try to build up the next generation. But that sense of China when they accuse us in Australia of having a Cold War mentality, I say you have a Civil War mentality. And you have a problem of being a continental country. Of course you're surrounded. That's the history of your geography. And the Cold War mentality, the Civil War mentality is their threats that they can take in China, Taiwan, into themselves. 23 million people that have chose a separate path. And I just leave that on the table because their future, we don't even discuss them here. So that nationalism pushes us back. And I think across the region and across the US and Australia, laws against foreign interference in our internal affairs and registering people as foreign agents to call out that attempt to subvert the Chinese communities in our own countries has to be part of it. And bit by bit, China has to learn there is a pushback from this approach to us. So it's not a positive view of mine. And then why does China come late to the region? When I hear, well, who after 1949, when they became communist, started sponsoring communist insurgencies in the region? Who, when they broke up with the Soviet Union, found the Khmer Rouge ally in Cambodia worthy of supporting? And to support to the extent of invading Vietnam in '79, attacking the Paracel Islands in '74, attacking the South Johnson Reef in '88. The use of force continually has been used by China on all these particular. Why did they come so late to the region? Because they were not part of community building that ASEAN went through. Very difficult, I pointed out. ASEAN was formed, and the Sabah dispute kept them for 18 months not able to unify themselves. And then I'll just end on someone asked the question about the code of conduct. In 1992, the very first ASEAN statement called for an international code of conduct. And it resurfaced after the Mischief Reef incidents by the Philippines, who took on and drew up the first code of conduct for ASEAN's approval that I pointed out was exchanged in March 2000. It failed because they couldn't agree on a geographic scope. China wanted the parasols excluded. 2018, they still wanted it excluded, so at least they're firm with us on that. I'll just end. Thank you.
The role of nationalism is interesting in China. If we are talking about popular nationalism, the nationalist thinking of the general public, the Chinese people, the 老百姓, then I think it is a constraint, but the constraint can be made large or small by Beijing, by the authorities. So popular nationalism, I don't think we should exaggerate its potency. But then we may need to talk about elite nationalism, taken on by prominent analysts and the decision makers themselves. And here I think it is very important. But I am not sure whether elite nationalism is a useful concept, because when you talk about elite nationalism, effectively we are talking about intellectual and policy thinking at the highest level. So it may be more useful to talk about frame of reference by Chinese elites about how to comport China in the modern world. And here, it becomes a very complicated question and a different question from what we are discussing here.
Thank you. On nationalism, how to address it? I think, well, first we have to also first understand how nationalism works. No? For me, I think there are two types of nationalism. One that is spontaneous, one that just comes out, arises out of the feelings of the people spontaneously. This tends to be reactionary, meaning it emerges in reaction to a perceived threat, usually the threat being seen as coming from an identified group. The other kind of nationalism is one which is not spontaneous, but rather deliberately created, shepherded, directed. And usually this arises out of state policy, a deliberate action or program on the state to actually promote these kinds of feelings premised on a kind of it's us against them mentality. In both cases, I think the way, therefore, to address nationalism, to try to manage it, I think, is one is with respect to access to information. People have to be given the means to determine whether the kinds of threats that they think they're perceiving and whether the information they're being given by states, whether it's true or not, and hopefully they'll be able to make the right decisions. The second, of course, is what I could loosely call good behavior or good faith behavior on the part of states, to not consciously use nationalism as an instrument for mobilizing the public in support of some state objective. Hence, especially now in an era of interconnectedness and with social media and the flow, almost free flow of information. The idea that nationalism could become or could generate threats to regional stability really should be considered more carefully. And the response, which is to try to promote access to information, to promote freedom of analysis and thought, really is something that all states should be working on. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor?
Just a couple of comments on nationalism. I think it is very dangerous when it comes to nationalism with sovereignty disputes and nationalism with maritime boundaries, because it handicaps the government in terms of making reasonable compromises if your population is going to criticizing you for selling out the national interest. Take the examples of sovereignty disputes which have been referred to International Court of Justice, those between Singapore and Malaysia, between Malaysia and Indonesia. It's because neither country allowed it to become an issue of nationalism. It was left to the professionals. The common people really didn't care who won, or a large part of them. And I think that enables the country, and the same with boundary disputes. Keep it to the professionals. Don't put it in the newspaper. The minute the common people, you're handicapped on what you can do. It gives you an advantage sometime to the other side. You can say, well, our people will riot if we agree to this. But on the other hand, there's very limited what you can do to make reasonable compromises when the nationalism card is played by other sides. So the extent that you can keep the debate between the professionals and the foreign ministry and your other branches of government, you're much better off.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's very interesting. You usually not touch upon the domestic politics and how it affects the territorial and maritime disputes, the region. But it's clearly that I would agree with Bob that nationalism, especially ultranationalism, some chauvinism, is dangerous in the way that it narrows the range of choice for the government, for the leaders at the time of crisis. And of course, particularly in the case of Vietnam, that we see more what also Batongbacal called the spontaneous, what happened that is more reactive nationalism, is more the tribal, patriotic nationalism that will be, that happen, at the perceived threat, from outsider. Of course, sometimes it's a natural for the popular feeling, in the case of crisis, they come together and they work out. But of course, that is quite dangerous, the way that if we promote it, we use it for the political purposes. That could be, the tiger can be get out of the cage, and it could be dangerous. And on the way that the other side of nationalism that is instrumentalized, it could be politicized, but one way or another to mobilize the people for the foreign affairs objectives. That would be really dangerous on that way. I think that for the question about the China's latecomer and the region, if we really see into the history, I think that it would be recommended for the history section, maybe in the conference workshop, to look into the regions, and we see that the Chinese in the past is more continental power, and also the interest in the sea is just at the beginning of the 20th century when the Japanese coming to the region. And if you look into the map, so surely in the 1909, from my understanding, that the China tried to go to the Paracels, and later on also the dispute, the civil war between the Chinas and the French colonial authority in Vietnam at that time is in the Annam and Tonkin. So of course I'll talk about that. Of course, 1974, China resort to the use of force to expel the South Vietnamese from the Paracels, and the 1988. So the use of force indicate, that's more than the China's about more let the latecomer, and they try to gain the control in the region by the use of force. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question, the fifth one. Ambassador from Cambodia raised the question. You mentioned about the 5 great up there of solution, and talking about the national interest. But another point I'm not very clear, that Your Excellency said that don't think COC is important, and we need not to have it. I may be wrong that, but
Chairman, thank you so much. I was trying to get as much as enlightenment from Professor Beckman. He's a very old hand, very respectful. He did mention that the legal binding is in the COC is not the real drive. According to him, he preferred to see confidence building measure. And so I asked him, when DOC in 2002 instigating Article 10, of which it say that party to this DOC should work out a COC in the foreseeable future. What if at that time you don't put it there? What would be how you manage order in the South China Sea now? Because I think there is a sequential, DOC 2002, and then it called for creation, and then Professor Carlyle speak a little bit about, it's even before that, the ASEAN, was it Malaysia who coined it, COC? Philippines, sorry. But I'm just wondering if the leader over there, the foreign minister, didn't put it there, what would you think? I'm trying to just being obscure here, but try to understand the point that you will make, that the legal binding is not from a legal point of view. You are a lawyer by training. You don't seem to think it is the most important thing.
My observations are that the international relations specialists and the political sciences think that if it's legally binding, all problems will be resolved. I remind them that the Law of the Sea Convention is legally binding with a compulsory binding dispute settlement system, but that does not prevent certain states from ignoring the provisions that it finds that are uncomfortable. And therefore, my understanding of the history of the DOC is that it was originally intended to be legally binding, and then there were objections, and at the end it was made not legally binding with a clause that will work toward a binding COC. But for the most part, it has been followed. States have not occupied any new features. The part that has been not observed is that states have failed to exercise restraint in some cases. But I don't see, and I know that it's been the holy grail of ASEAN to go after a legally binding COC, but my cynical view as a lawyer is that if it's legally binding, it isn't going to say anything. That's really obliging states to do anything serious. On the other hand, if it works, fine. But I cannot see, if it's legally binding, then it's a question, what if there's a dispute? Is it going to go before an arbitral tribunal and the result is binding on the parties? I doubt whether many states would be comfortable with that. My final point is that when I look at ASEAN documents over the history of ASEAN, the most important ASEAN documents were always done as declarations. The legally binding treaties are the technical detail that follow. The real compromises are in documents which are technically not legally binding. But that's where the real compromises were, and therefore a real compromise between China and ASEAN might be in a document that is not legally binding.
Thank you. We can have last one question. No? Okay. Thank you. Our section is short, but it's very important. Coming back to the COC and DOC, I want to supply you with some information. I used to be the senior officer of Vietnam in ASEAN in 2002. And we, together with the other ASEAN countries and China, we work hard on COC. But finally, we got only DOC. DOC is Declaration of Conduct. It is not bound anyone. It does not bound anyone. The reason is China refused to agree with the COC. That's why China and ASEAN agree that the two sides continue to make every effort to reach COC. COC is a document binding every party. That is code of conduct, not declaration of conduct. It lasts for over 10 years. The two sides reach agreement that China and ASEAN get down together to negotiate the COC. I think COC is being negotiated by the two sides. If the COC exists, for example, it will be good document contributing to the management, to peace, stability in the region. But we all know that it will take sometimes, maybe some years, to reach the COC. DOC is also important because at that time we cannot reach the COC. Instead, we get the DOC. The DOC help a little bit because though it is not binding anyone, but it encourages ASEAN and China to consider the conducts that you are going to take. That is information I'd like to supply you. To conclude this section, we must thank all of us. The result we achieved in this section is not much, but it lay a ground. Though the ground is not large, not solid, but we lay the ground for the continuation of discussion in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, because the South China Sea problem will be a long problem. I thank all the speakers, I thank all the colleagues to participate in this section. So now we have to give the floor to the director of DAV to conclude the seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Phung. We are just a few minutes away from the end of the 10th International Conference on South China Sea, Cooperation for Regional Security and Development. As we exchange our views over the last 2 days, I think that this conference marks another successful event in the series of conferences that DAV, together with the Federation of the Vietnamese Lawyers and the Foundation for East Sea Studies. I would like to give you some statistics. I don't know why, but I really want to ask my staff to provide it with you. You can, I think that we can have some statistics in order to make sure that this one is another successful event. We have more than 220 participants, local and regional and international, representing more than 50 research institutions, think tanks all over the world, Europe, America, East Asia, and especially from ASEAN. Thank you, Fifi, by the way, for being here with us in the last day. We have been taken care of by the local and regional reporters. There are about representatives from more than 70 newspapers and news outlets in the region, and not only from Vietnam, but we also have journalists coming from Japan and China. Another set of statistics, we have more than 30 presentations, and we have the number of questions, comments, and answers that reach to more than 200. And my staff told me that statistically, it is the most successful one, and I believe in them. I really don't want to conclude because it is the intellectual and academic exercise. We come out of the conference that we attend with a little bit of a headache, with a little bit of a confusion, because we have so many papers that we have still to digest when we are back at home. The homework is not done yet. And we cannot agree with each other on everything, like the last session we had. And I don't think that it is a good sign that we can agree on everything. But I really would like to share with you some points that I think important. Coming out of this 10th conference. The ripple effect coined by Professor Thayer is really the point I would like to say in the first place, because we come out of the conference here in Vietnam and others in the region. We would like to share the knowledge, to share the views with each other in order to sharpen ours, in order to learn from others. And I think we also would like to tell the policymakers about what we learn from each other. And so the ripple effect is there. And in the beginning section, I also said that the scholarship of South China Sea is getting richer with each of the conference. So we go back to our universities, colleges, teaching our students, and the ripple effect is really there. We think that after 10 years, with the sense of recapping what has been happening since the last 10 years, I think that we have a better sense and also greater sense of legal certainty. And I echoed what Professor Beckman was saying. I think that even though we talked about it last conference, and we might want to spend more time to talk in this conference, but the impact of the PCA rulings on the Filipino case would deserve more time to be discussed and analyzed. And in the relations with the idea of legal certainty, I think that we now can talk with a greater confidence about the rule-based system. We have a better sense of what we are talking about. So it can be applied to the interpretation of the UNCLOS, to the interpretation or expectation of the COC negotiation process, and even to the technical questions, including the IUU or the joint development that are served, as discussed, as the measure of confidence buildings. So in other words, the legal field is becoming less confusing for us over the last 10 years, and especially with the PCA rulings awarded 2 years ago. And it is really important for small and medium countries because the rule of law is somehow the weapons for the small and medium countries to protect the national interest. We all know that the legal system is not perfect, but it is the only thing we have so far. And that leads to the point of rule of law also suggests that we can now define the practice of cherry picking. Cherry picking, that means some practices are just applying the part of the laws that suits the national interest and ignoring the other part of the law. And I think through the discussion we can agree that it is not a healthy way of practicing and applying laws. Then we also have the idea of applying the law in its wholeness as practically as possible. And in this, I would like to see more discussions, for example, on the FONOP by the US, for example. The FONOP operation would be really better seen in the region if it is connected to the PCA rulings, if it is connected to the entitlements of the features in the South China Sea that had been made clear by the PCA rulings. And the rule of law is also make it clearer about the rule by law idea. And the rule by law idea, in my personal thought, is somehow related to the other practice that we don't want to see happening. That is the might make the right. And that relates to the discussion we have today about the, and just now about the balance of power changed in favor of China on the sea ground. And the topics about land reclamation, militarization is really worth of further discussion. I just forgot about the coercion in the seascape. Professor Beckman was talking about the fact that the South China Sea discussion has been internationalized. I agree with that. But I also want to add that it should be, and it is now being multilateralized. And in that context, the COC would be expected developing in that path, and also the role of ASEAN, the central role of ASEAN would be expected toward that, because ASEAN is the most convenient and effective way so far for us to bring all the parties concerned together, not only China and ASEAN countries. We are also clearer in thinking of the more feasible and practical ways to promote cooperation in the South China Sea area. And I think that environmental protection, fishery, fish stock protection, rescue, search and rescue for humanitarian assistance are the promising areas for us to promote cooperation among the party concerns in the region, not only for the sake of protection of environment or fish stock or life of the people, but also for the sake of promoting confidence-building measures among the party concerns. What I like to invite you to think after the conference is what should we do in order to make the next conferences better. We are celebrating the 10th anniversary, and the DAV and the other partners are also have already thought of the next 10 years of the 20th anniversary. And so help us, please, to improve the quality of the organization, the quality of the discussion for the next 10 seasons. I really want to see personally thicker papers, more well-researched papers, because we really want to have books, proceedings coming out of the conferences, and they are longer lasting than conferences, and the ripple effect is longer lasting, of course, with the books and with the reading materials, printed materials coming out of the conferences. It is on top of my mind, and I kindly ask you to help us with other ideas in order to make our conferences more productive in the futures. The last section was talking. Many among us were raising the question of nationalism. It is really important topic for us to discuss. But I just thought that when we are having conferences in the coastal provinces of Vietnam, I am told and I am witnessed the actual cases by the local people, especially the fishermen. Nationalism can be abstract to them, but the livelihood of the local fishermen are really something tangible. And last night, the leaders of the Da Nang city would tell us that the fishermen in Da Nang province are having hard time out there fishing. So please think about the livelihood of the people and connect our academic discussion with the livelihood of the local people. Last but not least, I would like you to join me in thanking us. We are not separating as the organizers or as the participants, but we are one team, and I think that we should congratulate ourselves on that endeavor for a success, for we have done a successful event, another successful one. But especially, I would like to join me to thank the staff of the ITSI Foundation, who are working very hard to make it happen, to make sure that everything is smooth for us to conduct in the academic exchange. I would like you to join me to thank the staff of the Sheraton Hotel, who are also showing the hospitality, not only from the professional point of view of hotel servicing, but also from the local hospitality, because they are from here, from Da Nang City. And last but not least, I would like you to join me to thank the two ladies in the interpreting booth. They are really talking more than us. They are interpreting more than 30, like I said, more than 30 papers, and helping us to understand each other through more than 200 times of asking, answering, and commenting. So please join me in having a big approach to all of the point I want to say. So, for us, each of the conference is like a reunion activity. We see familiar faces, we see people that have become our friends, and see you next time. And for all the participants who are traveling back to the cities that are not Da Nang, and especially who are traveling overseas, have a safe trip back home, and see you next year. Thank you very much.